Today I'm going to teach you how to make a D20 using our 3D printed D20 mold, also known as an icosahedron. Using the mold makes creating these so much easier than trying to tape it together, so let's get started.
Here are some materials you'll need to complete this project. We've got our 3D printed D20 mold from bluehillglass.com. You'll need 20 equilateral triangles. I'm using 2-inch triangles, but our mold will accommodate up to 4 inches. I've got some 3D printed wedges for doing the outer seams, some copper foil tape, I'll show you how I use that later, some quick clean for cleaning it, flux. I've got 60-40 solder. You can also use 50-50 for the inside seams and 60-40 for the outer seams. I'll talk more about that later. Some polish for cleaning and finishing it out, and obviously your soldering iron.
After putting the first 5 triangles into the mold, I'm going to spend a good amount of time just making sure that they're all lined up. It's really important that this first layer is all even and lined up very well because you're going to build your entire piece off of this first layer. Now go ahead and add a little bit of flux on all of those points and then also in the center. After you tack your first layer together, you want to take it off your mold and check that it all lines up properly, and you can see that the mold is not damaged by just using it to tack on. So when you're soldering a 3D project, you can always use 50-50 on your inner seams, the part that I'm doing right now, and then solder your outer seams using 60-40 solder. So the reasoning behind that is that you need to turn your temperature up on your iron to melt 50-50 solder. When you do the 60-40 on the outer edges, you're going to turn the temperature of your iron down. By doing this, you're going to have a less likely chance that you're going to have the solder heat up and have it drip through. Now, you don't have to go out and buy 50-50 solder if you normally use 60-40 for this project. While if you're a beginner, it might be a good idea just to make it go easier for you. But you can definitely do it with just 60-40. So that's what I'm doing here. Just remember that if you are using 60-40, when you do your outer seams, you're going to need to go slower, meaning let it cool down before you touch it up or add any more to it. You don't want to get it too heated up because then it will drip through more likely than it would if you used 50-50 on the inner seams. Once I finish that first set of 5, I can go ahead and add some more triangles into my mold. And once again, very important just to make sure that the sides of the 2 triangles I've already soldered line up nicely with the 3 that I'm adding here. Now I'm just going to put a little bit of solder there to tack these pieces together and also tacking in the center. Now at this point, if I messed up and my triangles are not lined up properly, I can always take it apart, melt that solder and take it apart and try again. Now you're just going to continue assembling your piece, putting in the triangles, lining them up, putting a little bit of flux and tacking it together. Pull it off of your mold to solder all of the seams, and make sure when you're soldering those seams that you are holding your piece level so that you can solder those seams nice and smooth. You may find as your piece starts to get more top heavy that you'll need to use one of your hands to kind of push down and put a little bit of pressure on it so that your triangles all line up properly. Now as you're going, you may notice that some of the triangles might get slightly off. While the closer to perfect the better, you can get away with a little bit, so you can always take a triangle and kind of put it in place and see if it's going to fit properly before you continue. And remember, if your triangles start to get off and not aligned anymore, you can always take that piece out and try again. The great thing about this mold is you can do so many things with it. So right here, you know, I could stop at this point and make an open like key catcher, or I could add the lid to it and put some hinges in it and make it a box. So it doesn't just have to be a completely solid D20 like what I've made. Now once I just have two pieces remaining, I like to go ahead and clean it. So I just spray some quick clean inside and then use a scratch-free scrubby pad that I've cut up and kind of clean up all in there. Now I am going to get more flux on it, but I just like to give it a little clean because while I can still get my hands in there, because it's going to be very tight in just a minute when I put the last triangle on before I do the outside. If you've got any solder balls inside, you want to go ahead and get those out, because in a minute it's going to be very hard to get your hands inside of it, especially if you're using clear glass like I'm using. You definitely want to get it all clean on the inside. Now we're going to go ahead and put our second to last triangle in, and it's very hard to show you guys what I'm doing at the angle right now, and when you're soldering it you're going to find that it's kind of hard to see in there as well. So just go ahead and tack it together, and then I'm going to take my last triangle and just kind of place it on there and make sure that it's going to fit, but I am not going to put my last triangle on yet. So the reason I'm leaving it open is because while I'm soldering the outer seams, if I have any of the lead drip through and go to the inside, I'm going to be able to get my soldering iron in there and get it out, or get my hand in there to clean it. So if I go ahead and close up the D20 with that last triangle, it's going to be really hard to fix anything if I drip on the inside. Now I'm using clear glass, so that does matter to me. If you're using opaque glass, then maybe that doesn't matter, but that's the reasoning behind leaving one of the triangles off. Now I'm ready to solder my outer seam, so I have these 3D printed wedges that I'm going to use to hold my piece up, and I want to make sure that that seam is level with the ground. Now brush on a little bit of flux, and then I find that tinning those copper foil edges before laying down the seam really helps the solder stick better. So that's what I'm doing here, is just tinning those edges, and now I'm going to lay down my solder line. After you lay down the solder, you can go back and kind of touch it up a little bit, but if you don't get it in the second pass, you probably want to let it cool down and come back to it later, because this is when the dripping is going to happen. So if you heat it up too much, it's going to drip through into the inside of your D20. Now if you've used 50-50 on the inner seams, this is probably not going to happen quite as often as if you used 60-40. Now you're just going to continue this process for all of these corners, all of these outer seams on your D20. You might need to take a break. I will admit this is a challenging project, and it does get a bit monotonous when you're doing the outer edges. Once you're done with all the seams, you want to go back and touch up any areas that are a little bumpy. The corners especially might need extra attention. Now that it looks the way I want and it's all cleaned up, I'm going to go ahead and clean the inside using some quick clean. So this is a second cleaning. You might say the first one's not necessary, but I just like to do that when it's opened up so that I can clean it really well. As you can see, it's a lot harder to clean the inside when you just have one triangle open. So that's why I like to do it twice. Use your judgment, do what you like. But as you clean this step, just make sure that you've got it cleaned out really well. There's nothing left inside. You don't want any of the scrubby pad left inside or any solder beads, because we're about to close this thing up and there's going to be no going back. Now I'm just going to tin those inner edges of the foil. You're not going to be able to solder the inside of that last piece, but since it's clear, I don't want any of the copper foil showing through. And now we're ready to put on our last piece. So first, put your triangle on just to make sure it's going to work. We're going to put a little bit of flux in all three of those corners. And now very carefully, I'm going to tack one of the corners. If I see that I've gotten it a little bit off, as you can see, there's more of a gap on the left side, I'm just going to heat that back up and pull the triangle back off and try again. And it's really important to try and get all of those seams as equal as possible. Now you can see that all of my seams are pretty wide, and if I try to solder those, it's just going to bleed right through. So I'm using a little bit of copper foil tape. I measure it to fit the seam, and then I'm going to kind of fold it down into that crevice there and push it down with my finger. And I'm just going to create a little trough basically, so to block the solder from bleeding through. Now you can do this with any of the seams, not just the last piece. So if any of your seams get a little bit too wide, maybe your triangles weren't cut as closely as you would have liked, you can do this for every seam if you need to. Put a little bit of copper foil tape in the seams. So if you do this, just remember to burnish it afterwards so that your foil is stuck well and it's not going to peel up as you're soldering as it gets hot. Now I can apply my flux and I can start soldering it just as I did all of the other seams. And I don't have to worry about it bleeding through on those wide seams because I've got my copper foil there to block it. So here I'm using my mold to be able to solder the points. It's very helpful because it holds that point level with the ground. Just make sure that if you do this, that your D20 itself is cooled down enough that it's not going to damage your mold. Remember, your mold is made out of plastic, so it will melt with a high temperature. I have used the same mold for creating my D20s. I've made about 20 of them for clients, and I still am using the same mold. It has gotten some divots in it and some burns, usually when I just use too much flux or forget to let it cool down before I stick it in the mold. And if this happens, you can smooth it out. Just get some fine grit sandpaper and just rub it over it and smooth it out, and it will be good to go for many, many more uses. Now I can solder my last seams, so I'm just being very cautious with these last seams. I'm going to put down a base layer. I'm not going to worry about it being pretty or not, and then I'm going to move it over and do my other one. So I'm going to do this for all 3 of these last seams, and then I'll go back and smooth them out if they're not nice and perfect the way I want them to be. I'm just trying not to heat it up too much and risk anything pulling up, such as the foil pulling up at this point. So even though these last 3 seams are a little bit wider than all the other seams, once it's all said and done, you are not going to notice the slight little bit of difference, little bit wider, that these last 3 pieces are going to be. You're really not, because there's so many seams on this piece. It's just not going to be noticeable. So don't worry about that. Now that it all looks the way I want, I'm going to clean it one more time. So I'm going to use some quick clean, spray it on my scrubby, and then really just scrub really well all of those seams. And here's my completed project. I just put it on top of a glowing nightlight, and I love the look that it gives off. So if you've created this piece using our mold, please share with me your projects. We're at Blue Hill Glass Studio on all social media, and we'd love to see what you've come up with.